Right, okay, so welcome everybody to the second lecture by Dr. Anthony Quinn on the series that we have started to host in Pietrisco, which is called Juliet on Film, 1916 to 1996. So this is the second lecture. The first lecture was actually a bit of a teaser, as Tony described it, to the 4 different films that he's exploring with us. And tonight is going to go into basically the first of the 4 iconic films, which is the 1936 film by director Cukor. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, George Cukor. No.
Yeah, and so just very briefly to say that Anthony Quinn is one of our team in Pietrisco, and he lives in Edinburgh. He has a lifelong interest in film and worked in cinema before becoming the deputy manager of the Edinburgh International Film Festival. He undertook honours degree in literatures in English at the Open University, which focused on literature from a number of nations, as well as detailed study of the origins and structure of the English language. His final year was dedicated entirely to Shakespeare. He also undertook a master's and PhD at the University of Edinburgh on Shakespeare on film. He graduated in 2014, and he has worked at the National Library of Scotland and the Scottish Catholic Archive. He recently jointly headed a course on major themes of William Shakespeare as interpreted through the works of Thomas Aquinas. And he's now retired and works in his local high school tutoring students with special needs. So without any further delay, I'm going to ask Tony to unmute himself. He's already unmuted, and take the floor. And thanks, Tony.
Okay, thank you. It's such a famous play, one that we all think we know so well because it's so familiar. I didn't really know where to begin with this. So I thought I'll take it back to the moment when Romeo sees Juliet for the first time and his reaction, and take it from there. Now in the play, one of the first things he says to Juliet is, "Oh, about Juliet, she doth teach the torches to burn bright." And this has been taken over the years and repeated and accepted that it is an announcement of her incandescent beauty. And that's interesting because beauty has been associated with Juliet from the very, very beginning. Everyone in the film is beautiful. She's always beautiful. Everyone accepts her as being beautiful, which is quite interesting because we don't actually know what Juliet looks like. There's no description of her anywhere in the play. We don't know her height, colour of her hair, colour of her eyes, anything. But that's because largely cinema is a visual medium and they like people to be beautiful because that brought in the audience. It's always promoted beauty as being important, particularly in silent times when people were focusing on faces. Beauty was taken as a sign of innocence, virtue, decency, goodness. It's quite an interesting fact that the first 3 versions of Oliver Twist that were made, at least 2 of them are French, Oliver Twist was played by a girl dressed as a boy because only a girl could give that look of beauty and innocence, so they promoted it as that. But also that line, "she doth teach the torches to burn bright," can be taken that Juliet is a generative source. She generates not just light, but energy, which works well within the play because it's really Juliet, not Romeo, who drives the play. And she does this through her actions, not through her beauty. She's the one who decides to get married. She's the one who decides to run away from the family. She's the one who fakes their own death and then plunges a dagger into herself. She's actually a very brave and courageous person, but in films always seems to come back to Juliet, beauty and virtue, and they tend to stop it there. So this was the first speaking film of Romeo and Juliet. There have been a number of short films, silent films, two major ones, 1916, which we talked about before. So it was interesting to see how this would treat Juliet, whether they would make it to the next stage. Sound was a huge, huge thing. So the question was, you know, was it going to change how Juliet was portrayed on stage or on film? So it was interesting to see how we're going to do that. So the big thing became about casting the film. We wanted Juliet to have a certain look. And the two people responsible for casting were these two people. I've got something on my screen. Is anyone else getting an interference about audio quality? Just me? Okay. Louis B. Mayer, MGM, and Irving Thalberg. And that's quite interesting. Thalberg was married to Norma Shearer, the person who was eventually cast as Juliet. His ambition in life, professional ambition in life, was to make sure that his wife was top of the tree in Hollywood. And he made no secret of that. And he actually announced that shortly after their wedding. They were married September the 29th, 1927. Louis B. Mayer was best man. And she was to be the first lady of MGM, which caused a lot of friction in Hollywood, particularly with other actresses. Joan Crawford had a very rocky relationship with Norma Shearer, said that she only got the parts because she was, quote, sleeping with the boss. She was really upset, apparently, when Norma Shearer won the Oscar in 1930. They had two children together, Irving Jr., born 1931, and Catherine, born a few years later. Catherine was named after this person here, Catherine Cornell, a name virtually unknown in cinematic circles and Shakespeare circles, but at the time she was agreed to be the greatest American dramatic actress of her generation. And she had just completed a tour of Romeo and Juliet opposite Basil Rathbone as her Romeo. Very close friend of Norma Shearer. Now, after the birth of her second child, Norma Shearer actually wanted to retire. She was in her mid-30s, she had two children, she had money, she wanted to dedicate her time to her family, but Thalberg and Mayer had different ideas. Warner Brothers had released Midsummer Night's Dream the year before, huge success, and they wanted to, they'd been planning this for a while, but they said, no, we've got to go ahead with it and do it now. Now, the casting was interesting. The biggest silent movie star, probably female silent movie star, was Greta Garbo. Enormously successful, celebrated for her beauty as well as her acting. And famous essayist and literary critic Roland Barthes was trying to explain her great appeal to the world, and he wrote, I'm reading this, Garbo belongs to that moment in cinema when capturing the human face still plunged audiences into the deepest ecstasy, when one literally lost oneself in a human image, when the face represented a kind of absolute state of the flesh which could neither be reached nor renounced. Hollywood loved Garbo, the camera loved Garbo, the public loved Garbo. Mayer wanted Garbo to be Juliet, but there was a big problem at the time. Garbo was the most successful actress at the time, film actress. She was working and had a very serious relationship with John Gilbert, who'd have been a silent actor. I think she actually ended up jilting him at the altar. But they got talking as they would do and stuff. Garbo was on a contract of $400 a week, which worked out at $460,000 a year, which was a lot of money. But she could be contracted to work in as many pictures as the studio thought she should do. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever. She's remained the same amount of money, $460,000 a year. John Gilbert was contracted to be paid $100,000 per film. Garbo was a bigger star than Gilbert at this time. He was on $100,000 per movie. So she took the studio to task, was trying to campaign, because she went and checked other actresses and their contracts, and she found, broadly speaking, the men were being paid a great deal more money than the women. So the big dispute went to court. She refused to be considered for the part of Juliet. She was younger than Shearer. So that was the end of that. Thalberg immediately jumped on and said that he wanted his wife, Norma Shearer, to play the part. Now, sorry, this picture on the right is Norma Shearer. Now that was filmed, it's a studio portrait that was filmed in the Garbo style. Louis B. Mayer wanted his actresses to look like Garbo because he could market films if they looked that way. She agreed with this, went along with it, and she got this portrait taken, lit by William H. Daniels, who worked with Garbo. I've shown this photograph to a lot of students of film. No one has recognised it as Norma Shearer, no one at all. So anyway, we were making the film, but the film itself is a smaller part of the legacy of the entire film, what happened before and what happened afterwards. So we have to explore those things in some detail to understand it all, the magnitude of it. And what's overlooked by a lot of people is that Norma Shearer, prior to this film, was a bit of a sex symbol. Her sex appeal was used to promote the film she was doing. She was seductively dressed in all her films by the chap who ended up doing the costumes for Romeo and Juliet. Gowns were often silk, very clingy. She actually had gowns designed that had to be worn without underwear. So this was part of her appeal. It sold a lot of films. But at the time, there was a sort of, in the background, a discussion going on about censorship, morality in movies. And Time magazine wrote an article which was quite good. And I'll read it out here. This is, I think, from 1932. They're talking about the influence of movies on people who go to see the movies. If, as is generally supposed, the cinema has an important influence upon the behaviour of those who watch the movies, there will presently be a large increase in the total number of strumpets in the USA. They used that word, strumpets. They then listed a number of actresses who said were acting this way immorally, and Norma Shearer's name was top of the list. Now, this was a small article. It wasn't very important at all, but this led, according to Cyril Kochberg, in an introduction to film studies, 3rd edition. That article, that precise article, led to the Catholic Church in America forming the Legion of Decency. It was initially called the Catholic Legion of Decency, then the Catholic League of Decency, but they changed the name a few times to bring in people from Presbyterian, Methodist backgrounds, etc. Those two things together resulted in one of the most important factors in Hollywood and was pivotal in how women were portrayed in film for the next 30 years. We'll come to that. And particularly on the making of this version of Romeo and Juliet. The Catholic League of Decency was started by this man, Archbishop McNichols of Cincinnati, who was Irish, moved to America with his family when he was a young boy. It is likely that he was pressurized into forming the Legion by Archbishop, and I hope I'm pronouncing this properly, Amleto Kikonyani, apostolic delegate to the United States at the time. Now, one of the Archbishop's associates was the person on the right, Joseph Breen. Joseph Breen was a newspaper editor, a devout Catholic, and he was involved quite heavily with the Legion of Decency. He had been publicity director for the 28th Eucharistic Congress in Chicago in 1926, which was a big event. Over 1 million people attended it over a number of days. This is a photograph from the closing mass of that Eucharistic Congress. About 1 million people there. That gave him experience in organising crowds, which became invaluable later on. Now, the Legion of Decency were actually quite well organised. They were dismissed out of hand initially by the film companies, but they knew that there were over 22 million Catholics in America at the time. And they thought they could argue this in terms of morality with the courts and Hollywood, or they could be more realistic and go for the jugular, go for money. That's what Hollywood existed on, money. So that's what they did. Their intention was either to get the film companies to censor the films more responsibly, or have that responsibility taken from them and have censorship imposed by the government. This is something the film companies had been against for some time. Now, there's a myth about the Hays Code, but we'll go to this. This is the Supreme Court of 1915. The Legion of Decency had done the research well. There was a case in 1915 that went to the Supreme Court, the Mutual Film Corporation versus the Industrial Commission of Ohio. And the case centred on the protection of free speech within the Ohio Constitution, which was very, very similar to the United States Constitution. Now, they were arguing against censorship, saying that the First Amendment of the Constitution was that Congress shall not make or pass any law abridging the freedom of speech. Interpretation of the word speech was the centre point here, because at that time, it was all silent movies. In the end, I mean, they said it could be non-verbal or visual. This is where it fell into the cinema side of things. In the end, Supreme Court ruled by 9-0. It wasn't a close call. It was overwhelming, 9-0, that the movie industry was a business that was conducted primarily for profit, and as such could not be treated the same way as the press or as an organ of public opinion. Supreme Court ordered that the movie industry could, in theory, be used for evil, and therefore they passed that censorship of the movies could not be deemed as being beyond the government's duty. The film industry was worth millions and millions. They didn't want outside interference. Irving Thalberg was quoted at the time as saying, "It's our mine, no one else gets to dig here." There had been, and there was at the time, a code of self-censorship existing in Hollywood. There's a sort of public myth, people say pre-code days, they're talking about the PCA code, but there had been from the very beginnings in Hollywood self-governing censorship bodies, but they had been largely ignored because the public wanted to see movies that were, gangsters, movies could get themselves out of themselves. They made a lot of money. Joseph Hays had been chosen to run this because he was quite a strong Republican and had friends in Congress, so they were left alone. So it had been quite a cushy number for them for a number of years. But another article appeared in Time magazine, and this time they named not just Norma Shearer, but Irving Thalberg himself, and said he was guilty of promoting his wife in all these immoral roles. And they said, "We strongly advise the public to avoid all films featuring Norma Shearer." He took this very badly, and he took quite a confrontational role, which in hindsight was probably not the best idea, but at the same time, he was a very powerful producer in Hollywood. He was extremely successful. He was the first man who tamed the money squandering directors of the early times in Hollywood. He sacked von Stronheim from the film Merry-Go-Round. No director had ever been sacked before. That was a colossal thing. He was a very powerful, very influential man. He knew what he was doing, so he was taking them on. The Legion of Decency brought in Cardinal Doherty from Pennsylvania, who was a tough businessman. He had expanded the archdiocese, built schools, hospitals, colleges, and I think at the time, the largest secondary school in the world was named after him. So he was also very organized as well. So they decided to go after Hollywood by hitting them in the pockets. This was after Thalberg had a meeting with other companies, film companies. They raised over $2 million, which is equivalent to about $33 million in today's money, spent it on advertising in newspapers, magazines, billboards, telling the public they should not be influenced by, they called them professional do-gooders. They were careful not to mention any religions or priests or rabbis or anything at all. Professional do-gooders said, "You go and see what you see, ignore everyone else." So they fought back. They organized Legion of Decency. They organised boycotts, they organised rallies, they wrote to Congress, they had children going around door to door, and it was very, very effective. Takings across the board fell by 40%. 40% across the board. 50,000 school children held a mass protest in Michigan. So things were going from bad to worse. And then the Motion Picture Theatre Owners Association had a meeting with Thalberg, and they told him they would be closing 475 cinemas in Philadelphia alone within the next 2 weeks. And they said that Philadelphia would be the first of several cities where hundreds of cinemas were closed. So we're looking at the downfall of the cinema industry. There's no point making movies if no one's going to see them. You won't get your money back. So a truce was reached. The truce was, roughly speaking, the League would stop the boycott and promise not to push for government censorship if the studios agree to take a stronger stand against immoral films. A separate censorship body that worked within the confines of what existed already, the NPPDA, was set up. Will Hayes was president of the NPPDA. That had been in place, the Hayes Code had been in place since 1930, but it had been ignored. So that was what had hurt the, I'm getting some noise here. Is everyone on mute? Yeah. That is what had hurt the League so much. There was something in place to do the censorship, they were just ignoring it. So that's what they were going to do. They brought in a different staff within that body, and it was put under the governorship of Joseph Breen, the chap we'd seen earlier. And he had a huge staff and a huge budget. He was given complete control. Every single film made by every single studio in America had to pass over his desk to get his personal seal of approval. If he didn't give a seal of approval, the film would not be released. Extremely powerful role for one man. This left a serious problem for Irving Thalberg and Louis B. Mayer, because Norma Shearer, the very actress they had attacked on a number of occasions, we advised strong guard over all pictures that feature Norma Shearer. She had been cast as Juliet, a young girl who marries and has relations with her husband before she's 14 years of age. This was a big problem. Thalberg immediately set about changing Norma Shearer's image. He knew Joseph Breen had been educated by the Jesuits and that he had a devotion to the Virgin Mary. He used this. He also took out all references to Juliet's age from the film script. There's no reference to Juliet's age in the film. He also told the publicity people that if any academics or any in the public got in touch and asked about Juliet from Shakespeare's play, they were to tell them that Juliet in the play was 16, not 13. They were gambling on the fact that they thought most people who go to see movies in Hollywood are not too interested in Shakespeare, so they'd get away with that. So it was a deliberate reshaping of Norma Shearer's image, and it started here with the hairstyle. Now, I went through this the last time, I'm not going to go through much. This is an original publicity shot from the film. And it says on the back here that the hair has been meticulously copied from this painting, Fra Angelico of Fresco. The fresco of Fra Angelico at the Annunciation. This was the first indication of the importation of Christian virtue and chastity into the film. This was done purely to appease Joseph Breen. Now, it also gave a sense of historical authenticity, which they've been trying to promote for the film, not just another Hollywood weepy movie. This was something epic, something historical that you had to see. Now, in the Bible, what happens is the angel Gabriel appears before Mary and greets her with the words, "Hail, thou art highly favoured, the Lord is with thee, blessed art thou among women." Prior to this, the angel Gabriel has visited Elizabeth, who's to be the mother of John the Baptist. And when Mary visits Elizabeth, she is greeted with the words, Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb. This is from Luke. The combination of those two lines are the beginning of the prayer, Hail Mary. This was not lost in Joseph Green. Juliet, Norma Shearer, is being transformed into a virgin, representing chastity and purity within the Catholic Church. It didn't stop there. He went on quite a number of things. Now, he made a big thing of sending, the studio made a big thing of sending photographers to Italy to photograph balconies, armour, paintings, to try and make the whole thing more historical. Now, they took, for balconies alone, they took a total of 2,749 photographs, different balconies, loggia, I think the term is, reinforced windows, all over Italy. Of the 2,749, they chose this one on the left here, which is not a balcony at all. It's a pulpit in the cathedral in Prato in Italy. That wasn't a coincidence. The pulpit was commissioned to exhibit a holy record, the Sacra Cintola, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The supposed remains of a girdle, a long strip of cloth tied around the waist, that was worn by the Virgin Mary. That relic is still exhibited from that balcony 5 times a year on days associated with the Virgin Mary. The balcony itself, the balcony scene, was to be the central part of the whole film. Every piece of publicity had the balcony scene in it. It was supposed to be promoted as a great thing of romance. So that was very, very important. That's quite ironic, actually, because the balcony scene itself in the play, at the time of Shakespeare's writing and performing of the play, was not a success. The way the stage had been set, Juliet would appear above where the musicians were. This was the balcony, which meant that Romeo, in turn, had to turn his back on the audience. Turning your back on someone in Elizabethan times was a huge insult. Queen Elizabeth had somebody beheaded for doing that to her in court. So when they did this actually on stage at the time, to the crowd of the people standing in front, the groundlings as they were called, quite a rough crowd, most of them were quite drunk, etc. They booed, they threw things, they didn't like it at all. It's not a coincidence that of all the plays that Shakespeare wrote, and so many of them involved with love and devotion and longing, this is the only one which features a balcony scene. It wasn't a success, and yet now it is the most recognisable aspect of Romeo and Juliet. Put a girl under a balcony, put a girl in a balcony and a boy underneath, and everyone, anywhere in the world, will say Romeo and Juliet. So that was that. But there was also another aspect to go on to things. In order to try and make Juliet more virtuous, they desexualised Romeo. This is a good example here. This is from the film, the morning after scene when Romeo has gone up to the balcony to spend the night with his new bride. Now, Leslie Howard was no Clark Gable. He was not what you would call a macho man, a man's man. He was a romantic lead at the time. So that wasn't such as difficult as it wanted to be, but they had to portray Romeo as sort of safe and controlled. He was actually made an asexual Romeo. Now, if you have a look at this scene, and this is a scene that occurs after a collage of shots when he goes up the balcony, it's roses, stars, moonlight on the water, a big romantic score, then birds twittering in the morning, and then you come to this scene here. Romeo is lying half on top of the bed with his head resting on Juliet. She's under the protection of the covers. They're both fully clothed. Not only are they fully clothed, it's the same outfits they were wearing the night before. So Juliet's not even removed her jewellery in this scene. And neither she nor Romeo have a hair out of place. Romeo awakes, looks around in surprise as if he's just fallen asleep, as if that's the only thing that's happened on the first night of their honeymoon. This is not the morning scene of a newly married couple who have stolen a night of passion. Even the first kiss, where he kisses her, is shielded. The camera's looking over his shoulder, so you don't actually see them kiss. This is an asexual marriage where there's love, romance, devotion, respectability, but no sex. That wasn't an accident either. There exists a letter in the archives from Joseph Breen, head of the PCA, to Louis B. Mayer, in which he urges caution in this scene, because this is a scene where it's the most passionate bit within the play. People come and they sing a body song later on, etc. But Breen expressed anxiety and stated, I'm quoting here, "We therefore earnestly recommend to you that you play this scene so as to omit all action of them lying on the bed, fondling one another in a horizontal position and pulling one another down." The scene also works on another level, a more subtle level. Not only does an asexual Romeo promote a virtuous Juliet, a passive and unthreatening Howard, Leslie Howard, becomes more reactive than proactive to Norma Shearer. Norma Shearer was the star of the movie. She got top billing. She is, to this day, the only genuine A-listed star, Hollywood star, at the time to take on the role. This irked Leslie Howard. It did not irk Irving Thalberg. He was quite happy to promote that. So that was that. We still had the problem of Juliet's age, which wasn't mentioned in the film, but we're talking really about Norma Shearer's age. She was 34, thought herself too old, didn't initially want the part. She wanted Catherine Cornell to get the part. But Thalberg thought this was okay, we'll sort this out. She was 34, so he got suitably mature actors in the other roles. Leslie Howard was 43. Basil Rathbone was 44. John Barrymore was 54. It wasn't a problem. When they appear together, it's not really a problem. You don't think about any age difference at all. But there was a problem when they had scenes with Juliet and her handmaidens. There was quite a lot of handmaidens in this. These parts were given out to starlets, people just starting out in movies. Quite a few of these girls were in their teens. When she stood next to them, the age difference was quite apparent. It was a big banqueting scene. It was actually a big musical number because that's what they wanted in Hollywood at the time. Most films had a musical number. Even up to later on, musical numbers were inserted into films to appease the public. Even in something like Casablanca, when you look at it now, it's got a sort of very uncomfortable cabaret scene, which doesn't really fit with the movie, but it was part of the Hollywood thing. Put a musical number in, the public like that. Huge big musical number here, where Juliet dances, I think it's for about 11 minutes, with 14 handmaidens. She's the star, everything works around her. When she stood next to them, you could tell there was an age difference. She was very upset. So they brought in someone by the name of William H. Daniels. He was the top photographer, director of photography in Hollywood at the time. Now he knew, at the time, they used silver nitrate film. This gave very, very sharp images between black and white. And he knew that they were using that film, but they had to do something to try and make Juliet look more realistically the same age as the others. Now, Daniels was also Garbo's preferred photographer. He worked with her on 21 films. He was also a good friend of Norma Shearer's brother, Douglas Shearer, who was a pioneer in sound. He ended up winning 7 Oscars. Norma Shearer and Douglas Shearer are the first siblings to win an Oscar each. Under instructions from Daniels, and to disguise Shearer's age, film stock they were using was overexposed. And then this was compensated for by giving the negative reduced development. This resulted in a less contrasting print. It gave a sort of pearly effect, which was adapted by MGM after this point and other film companies, most notably RKO, which is why so many films of the 30s look kind of pearly. It's because they were using this effect. He also changed the lighting. He used a rifle light, which is a large 1 kilowatt tungsten bulb sealed in a hemispherical metal reflector, which had fluted surfaces, and this resulted in a softer light than arc floodlighting, which had been used up to this point. So the combination of the film stock and the soft lighting went so far to disguising Shearer's age. This pleased Norma Shearer. She was quite a vain actress, apparently. She turned down the role of Mrs. Miniver because in the film she was supposed to have a grown-up son and she didn't want to appear that old. But Daniels did one other thing which caused a bit of a problem at the time. It still didn't work the way he wanted it to. So he had all the ladies in waiting wear green makeup splashed all over their face and their hands. This didn't show up because the film was in black and white. And they continued that for decades after this. Some Like It Hot, Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis are wearing the same green makeup from the same formula they developed for this film. So it worked quite well. The result was everyone sort of looked the same. Now we're running out of time. I don't want to go over too much stuff we did before because we've done it before, but I'll take any questions at the end. But the thing about this film is, it wasn't the film itself that's important. It was before and after the film. And there was 3 different legacies which were hugely important. The first one is this one. This is one of my particular peeves. This is a scene in the play where Juliet's mother is suggesting to Juliet she should consider marriage to Paris, and the nurse is there. It's played for laughs nowadays. It's a hugely important scene. It foreshadows the tragedy at the end. These 3 women here that you're looking at represent the 3 ages of women in Shakespeare's time. Young, middle-aged and old. Juliet's young, her mother's middle-aged. The nurse is old. We know she's old from things in the text, the language used about her teeth, her size, they say that she's fat. This was a thing to how we described old people. And she's forgetful. The dialogue about the earthquake, etc. This is to show that she's forgetful because she's old. Now, the casting for this part was given to a comedy actress by the name of, it's going right out of my head now, I'll find it, don't worry. She was a comedy actress because in the Warner Brothers film, they had given support roles to comedians, and that worked well. The difference being, of course, Midsummer Night's Dream's a comedy, Romeo and Juliet is a drama, tragedy. Edna May Oliver, that's her name, Edna May Oliver. She usually played drunken aunts, a bit inebriated, a bit silly. She was told by Thalberg to jolly it up because they thought tragedy of Romeo and Juliet is too much for their usual going audience to go and see. So she played this for laughs. She plays it, you know, she absolutely sways, she screeches, she looks like she's drunk. She actually plays it almost, someone described it as a pirate in drag. And I think that works very well. That lessens the scene because not only is this the 3 ages of women, it's the 3 stages of their life in Shakespeare's time. Maiden, wife, and widow. Juliet's the maiden, her mother's a wife, the nurse is the widow. This is foreshadowing Juliet's life. This is the path she's going down at this point. They're telling her, this is the path you're going down and it's okay. Everything goes wrong when she meets Romeo. She goes down the same path, but instead of doing it over 30 or 40 years, Juliet does it over 5 days. That is the real tragedy of this play. Juliet's life starts when she meets Romeo. She goes through her whole time span of her life, what her life would be, but dies 5 days later. It's a very important scene, and it's done from this film. Nowadays, it's mostly played for laughs, and it's a great shame. Juliet is the only female lead in Shakespeare who has a mother in the plays. In fact, she has 2. The nurse is a surrogate mother to Juliet, and they both end up betraying her as the play goes on. It's a hugely important scene, and it's been belittled because of this film. The second legacy was really the continuation of the Victorian idealism of Juliet as being an object of virtue and beauty, and not much else. And this was done partly because of Joseph Breen, but partly because this is how Thalberg wanted his wife to be the focus of beauty. He wanted to celebrate her beauty. Nothing much more is done about Juliet in this film. The third legacy is by far the most reaching, not just for Juliet, but for all leading ladies in all films over the next 32 years. The strict adherence to the new PCA code enforced through one person's views inevitably has a huge controlling effect. It's a vastly complicated subject, we can't go over it all just now. But whether you agree or disagree with Joseph Breen's or the PCA's viewpoint, that is to a large extent immaterial. Adhering to one view, regardless of what it is, automatically excludes all other views. Women's roles in film were curtailed, resulting largely in a series of stereotypical roles from this point. Those roles may have changed or did change in content over the style and content over the decades, but they still work within definite parameters. And those parameters were that the leading lady in cinema reflected the idealized fantasy of the perfect woman in society at the time. Now, oh, sorry, I've just lost my connection now. Not only were women portrayed over the period, and you can actually see this changing in Juliet over the next decades. In 1954, the next big film after this, Juliet is a beautiful Hitchcockian blonde, cold, leading an imprisoned life, waiting for rescue from a handsome leading man to whom the rules don't apply. In 1968 film, she's a child of the 60s, beautiful, sexually active, liberated. And it's not until 1996, when we get Claire Danes, that we get a Juliet for whom beauty is not the central pillar on which her existence is built around. But it goes a lot further than Juliet. Not only were women portrayed according to the ideology as an array of virgins, vamps, victims, suffering mothers, child women, and sex kittens, there was no exploration of subjects that Breen or the PCA disapproved. This included, but was not limited to, crimes against the law, sex, homosexuality, LGBT, vulgarity, obscenity, profanity, religion, violence, or any subject judged to be proper, improper, immoral, or against the national interest. All of this was depending on the viewpoint of one person. That's ironic. I think it's hardly adherence to the First Amendment to protect freedom of speech that the film industry was claiming to defend in 1934. Yeah. So the 1936 Romeo and Juliet, to sum up, it's an important film. It's not a great film. It's not a noteworthy attempt at a Shakespeare play, but it was never really meant to be. There's very little that we described in the film that's historically accurate. The publicity for the film went to great lengths, bragged about the building of 54 full-size sets, copied from Renaissance Italy. Be that as it may. It was the costumes and the glamour that were at the forefront of this movie. Everything was done to make Juliet and all the women in the movie appear glamorous and beautiful. If you go through the expense sheet for this film, and I've been through it all, you will find, amongst other things, costings for bolts of silk and other expensive material, 12 shoemakers who made shoes for the ladies, 25 knitting operators, 250 seamstresses, and 500 lipsticks. I think that's wonderful. Small point, but it's a clear indication that although there was some effort to promote the film as an acceptable reproduction of the Renaissance world, the real intention was to adapt and present the play within a contemporary Hollywood context for a contemporary Hollywood audience. That's absolutely fine. As a film, it's a great example of Hollywood of the 1930s. Glamorous, full of stars, a big musical number, some comedy. Some Shakespeareans object to this. I don't. We started tonight with a quote from William Shakespeare, but I'd like to end with a quote from Alfred Hitchcock that he made on the set of Spellbound. It's only a movie, Ingrid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. I just wanted to ask you one thing, just off, before anyone asks for any question. Could you show everyone your T-shirt? Because I think that's...
I did that at the beginning.
And I think
that's great. I speak for 50 minutes on Shakespeare, and the only thing you're interested in is a T-shirt. Charming.
No, it's a good way of opening a debate. So if anybody has a question, that would be, I'd quite like to open it to the, because I'll end up asking questions and I don't want to kind of take over. So anybody has a question that would like to ask, this is the time to talk and to unmute yourselves. Or you can type it if you want. But yes, Mary, would you like to ask a question? Yes.
Yes. How well was this actually received, Tony? Because
well,
it's been adapted and whatever, but how was it received by the audiences at the time?
Well, it was nominated for 4 Oscars, I think, 5 Oscars, but won 1. And there were different accounts now as to how much it cost. But the usual thing, for the tax man, they said it cost $800,000. For other people, they said it cost $500,000. It was not a huge success with the audience. It is not a great film. Part of the thing was, it was a strange thing. They made a huge thing about the premiere of the film. It was to be broadcast live across America, and it was all set up. This was on September the 4th, 1936. Irving Thalberg died that day, and they still went ahead with the premiere.
Oof.
So they had all the stars attended, but no one spoke to them. They didn't speak to anyone at all. The whole thing was a very muted affair, a very downbeat affair. That did not help with trying to promote the film, because the only thing that people thought of at the time was that film came out, Irving Thalberg died the same day. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't. They did a lot of things. They got Clark Gable, who was the biggest star at the time, to record a trailer which was shown in other cinemas, saying how it's a wonderful film and it makes him proud to be a member of the cinema industry. They also set up strange things. They had an interview in the Hollywood Cavalcade with a chap called Sobel, who was the leading showbiz guy at the time. And he interviewed Shakespeare from Beyond the Grave. And Shakespeare was saying, you have to go and see this film because I've been dead all these years and the only person who can really play Juliet is Norma Shearer. So you should go and see her. They tried to promote it that way, but the audience didn't really buy it. At the time, it was interesting that Catherine Cornell has never made any movies. Nobody's really heard of her, because at that time, there was a general feeling that Shakespeare was for the stage, it wasn't for the cinema, and Shakespearean actors frowned upon the cinema. After this film was made, there was no major Shakespeare film made again until 1944. That was Olivier's Henry V. Olivier has gone on record of saying that in his film, it was the first one that had a magnificent score, took things seriously, had a cast of proper Shakespearean actors, was in colour. He said in his words that Henry V was the first Shakespeare film. There's a lot of validity in that. Okay. This is a film that uses Shakespeare's words, but it's really a Hollywood film. Mm-hmm. It's not really a Shakespeare film, but that's okay. You don't have to go and sit in front of a cinema and be educated and be very academic. Those who did go to see it quite liked it, but it was quite common at the time to go and see a film a couple of times, if you liked it, as today. Most people who went to see this film only saw it once. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a great success, no.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to ask a question? Shall I ask one?
Please do, Rosella, yes.
Yes, right, okay. So, well, you said earlier that, you were talking about Greta Garbo, yeah, and how she got a little bit fed up because she was being paid so little compared to male actors in Hollywood, yeah, at least, yeah. And here it seems he also said that it's Juliet that moves the film rather than Romeo. She's the real, yeah, protagonist, the actress.
Yeah.
In the actor sort of role. Do you think in this scene, it's, the 3 women is kind of a quite central scene, isn't it? It's like as if the women are actually upholding, in a way, the tragedy, probably. I think you said to me before that, this is really a scene which is important because it, anticipates the final tragedy. Did you want to say something a bit more about that and about the role of women? How maybe this film did invite?
Well, I think one of the things you could say is most people now, I meant it when I said, think of Juliet, they think of her as being beautiful. That's the most important thing. Or not the most important, it's the thing that comes to mind. But it's Juliet who decides they should get married. It's Juliet who defies her family. Juliet who plays courage by taking the suicide. And she does all these things. She moves the play along. She has about 18% of the dialogue. Romeo has 20%. But she does this by her own actions, drives the narrative by her own actions. She doesn't occasion the actions of male protagonists, as happens with other actresses like Desdemona or Ophelia. She's a very important character. The amount of dialogue they actually have changes from who's directing it, what they cut out, etc. But we still think of, and in fact, this film and the 1954 film and the 1968 film, they all have something in common, which is not in Shakespeare's play, but it drives the beauty thing. In each of those films, you have a character playing Rosaline, who's in the play. She's not in the play. She's talked about in the play. She's not in the play. But in each of these films, you have Rosaline appearing. And she's usually, she's very beautiful, and they do her in different ways. And in the 1954 film, they actually give her some lines to speak. But in each of these films, they introduce her, and then she's replaced by someone even more beautiful, even more virtuous, as if this is what the character, what is important about the character of Juliet. So it's a fact that everyone thinks of Juliet as this incredibly beautiful woman, but we don't know what she looks like. And beauty is not her most important feature by far.
Yeah, and also, I mean, what I meant to say is that she's changed from the vamp into the basically replica of the Virgin Mary. The kind of
Shearer,
etc. So all the coiffure and the costumes, etc. And Greta Garbo. So Greta Garbo was the person who they would have liked to, but she turned it down. Is that right? Greta Garbo was also famous because she was a bit of a perverse kind of image, because she was a lesbian at the time, so I don't think she would be made.
They didn't publicize that.
Yeah, she wouldn't be making a very good role, even if they changed their hairstyle or everything. Well, maybe Norma Shearer being kind of heterosexual, married and everything. I don't know how the public saw these things. But what else I wanted to say was that, this image, if we look at it from a Catholic viewpoint, not that we're trying to bring in a Catholic slant.
Can I perhaps interject here? We've got Fred Marinello, we've got on here now. Fred, you had a discussion with me a while ago about some of these parties which were organised by the chap in Hollywood. Was Greta Garbo or anyone ever mentioned that? Could you?
Yes, Garbo was, along with Barbara Stanwyck. And other Barbara Stanwyck, Greta Garbo, the girl that forget her name, very famous actress, went around with Howard Hughes for a while.
Catherine Hepburn.
Catherine Hepburn. They were the studios, of course, frowned upon anything that was not heterosexual, but it was well known within circles that they were homosexual, lesbian. But the studios, obviously for clearly financial reasons and every other kind of reason that's involved within studio acting, could not reveal that. And it only came to light years later, along with the male homosexual stuff. So that was really, whether it had a religious overtone or whether a religious content, we're unsure about that. But certainly the Hollywood cinematic viewing for the public was of heterosexual relationships being the norm, which in fact now we know nowadays is not the case. But it hasn't made an iota of difference nowadays. But 50, 60 years ago, absolutely. So
that, it's quite interesting that they had, sorry, George, I didn't mean to interrupt, George Cukor was chosen And the reason they gave for choosing him, the quote was a woman's director, because he got good performances at Catherine Hepburn. He even got a very good one out of, I forget her name, the one that didn't go on with Norma Shearer, Joan Crawford, which led Norma Shearer to say, well, not only is he a very good director, he's a very patient director as well. He was known as a women's director. He was also known as an obedient director. This was the terms used. Now, women's director at the time was a term that was used for homosexual. And the idea was, when teamed up with the term obedient director, it was more than a hint of blackmail. Thalberg chose Cukor, and he gave him the instruction that his wife had to be top of the tree, and Cukor did as he was told. There's all these sorts of things, they call it the lavender list, and I've done a lot of research into finding. I can't find anything anywhere of any physical list of the people, but the studios did know what they were up to, what they were doing. They also had people who would go around and pay off brothel keepers when stars went there and got drunk and passed out. Instead of phoning the police, they would phone the head of the studio, and the studio would send somebody out and pick somebody up and drive them home. So there was a lot of scandal, obviously, within Hollywood, but that is not what was projected by Hollywood for their stars. And you can see even there, in that picture we're looking at just now, 3 women, Juliet is holding a bow and arrow. It's Cupid's bow and arrow. The first thing, she's got this Cupid bow and arrow to try and make it look like this is about romance. This is chocolate box romance. It's not true love. It's not passion. It's one of these myths that goes on about Romeo and Juliet. Nowadays, a lot of people think it's about teenage love. It's not about teenage love. It's about first love. It just so happens this time it happens when they're teenagers. Because first love can happen at any point in life. That's why I think why so many divorces and stuff. Romeo says it himself. Romeo in the play has also thought himself as, and probably was, a bit of a ladies' man. And the friar makes reference that to him as well. He says he's not chastising Romeo. Romeo says about being chastised for loving, and the friar said not loving, but for doting. He's always been this Renaissance poet after the unobtainable, pretending his love. And he says in the play, have I not loved till now? And in the films, virtually all the films, quite a lot of the performances you go and see, the emphasis is on the word loved. Have I not loved till now? And really, it's far more dramatic and more of a dramatic impact when you put the emphasis at the end, where he says it with surprise. Have I not loved till now? It's come as a shock to him that he's in love. It's come as a shock to him that everything he thought was love before was just doting, frivolous. This is why the banishment scene in Romeo and Juliet, that is Romeo's big speech. Juliet has about 4 or 5 big scenes. Romeo really only has one, the banishment, where he wants to die rather than be separated from Juliet. That's the key to his character. Of all the plays, all the times I've seen this on stage, I've only seen it done properly once, where it actually moved you. You understand the feeling, his anguish, that something that he thought didn't exist before and then realised it did exist, thought it was unobtainable to him, has engulfed him, and he's reveling in it, and then it's torn from him with great pain. He has to reflect on that. Leonardo DiCaprio is the closest we've seen to on film. He got, and this goes back to the beauty thing, he was ridiculed for being in that role because he was so pretty. And I could do a whole thing about the personal insults he got from critics for that film. In my opinion, he's the best Romeo we've seen on film, and Claire Danes is the best Juliet we've seen on film because she's unafraid, she's courageous, she's not portrayed as being beautiful. At the end of that film, she's got snot, she's crying, there's no good. You look at the death scene in these films, I didn't go through it on this one because we've done it before. The death scene in this film is incredibly beautiful. She's never looked better in her life than when she's dead. It's quite ironic. And it's the same in the 1954 film and the 1968 film. 1968, they actually brought in a special lighting man, again, like 36, who studied Renaissance art paintings, and they lit it. You can see Romeo, he gets a flaming torch which is flickering, and he puts it just out of sight. And from that point, the lighting changes. There's no flickering. Everything's soft, amber, beautiful. Juliet has never looked better in her life than when she's supposedly dead. And then she wakes up and her husband's dead. Her whole world is ended, but she still takes time to take off her ribbon, you know, and unleash this mane of, you know, auburn, dark hair. Beauty permeates the execution of this film, this play, but it's not central to the play. It is seen today, and it does come from Victorian times largely. You still see it as billed as the greatest love story ever told, the greatest love story in the history of the world. It is not the greatest love story ever told, for the simple reason is it's not primarily a love story. It is a tragedy that is voiced through a love story. The clue's in the title, The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. No one ever calls it that. It is one of Shakespeare's greatest tragedies. It is one of Shakespeare's most underrated tragedies because we are so familiar with it. We think we know it all. We don't.
And that's what the last line of Shakespeare himself says. No, this is the no tragedy was ever heard before of the story of
Juliet.
and Romeo.
And her Romeo.
I don't know if that's the right line, but you know, that's what Shakespeare says himself.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you another question about this photograph again. Sorry if I'm so
no.
this photo. You talked about, you know, all the seamstresses and all the lipsticks and so on and so forth. Obviously, this is a black and white film now. I've done a little bit of research, not very much, but you know, I mean, in 1939, we've got Gone with the Wind and we've got The Wizard of Oz, the first two big Technicolor films, but Technicolor films were already out since about 1921, 1927. There was one. I mean, if this was such a huge, iconic film, and all these lipsticks were obviously tried not to give the right hues of red or whatever, why did Cukor and the producers not make it into a Technicolor?
Yes, that's a very good question. Part of it, I think, was expense. It was an expensive build. They did build all those sets. But why did not spend more money? I think the budget for this was roughly the same as the budget for the 1954 film. And the 1954 film, the budget, 500,000, is the most commonly agreed on figure. The £500,000 for that film, 1954, was the same budget that Zeffirelli was originally given in the 1960s. So from 1936 to 1967, when they were making the film, the budget for all three films was roughly the same. Now, whether or not they thought it was too expensive, if we make it in colour, it's going to be more expensive, but would it have attracted more viewers to the cinema? It's a very good question. When you're making an epic of that size and the banqueting scene, they made a big thing about this is such a big epic. When we have a banquet, it's a real banquet and it's a huge big scene. The dancing alone, I think, takes 11 minutes. They got a separate director in for that part alone. The costumes were outrageous. You have to see Paris's costume in that scene to believe it. He has this huge, it sounds like something out of Monty Python. He has this huge outsized codpiece with gold fleur-de-lis painted on it, which caused a lot of laughter and objection on the set at the time. But if you're having something that epic and you're selling it on a grand scale to the public, should it have been in colour? Yes, I think it should have been.
I think it would have definitely caught the eye even more, because it does already catch the eye, you know, with that scene of the banqueting with the dresses that you showed us before, and her dress being completely translucent somehow, you know, it reflects the light more than the...
The lighting would have been different for a... The lighting would have been completely different for a colour film, for a black and white film. I don't know if that was an issue. The green makeup would have shown up on a colour film, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it loses something being in black and white.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is, I'm sorry, this is bringing in some sort of kind of Catholic or
Oh yeah,
Yeah, suppose imagery again, always on this photograph that we got stuck on for half an hour now. You know, this Shearer's Virgin Mary. You've got, and then actually another question on this in the end as well that will follow. Then you've got the mother, who is the Saint Anne. Then the widow, who could be Anne from the presentation at the temple. You know, there's quite a lot. So I think there's quite a lot of Christians.
Oh, there's huge imagery in this. It's not just in the paintings in the background as well. There's a lot of religious imagery.
The three main women that, you know, kind of were involved in bringing Jesus Christ to the, you know, the kind of the Saint Anne, you know, with the Immaculate Conception, having Jesus Christ and saying yes to the angel. And then
you got to remember the first scene in this film has changed. They're going to the cathedral.
Yeah.
They bring religion in at the very beginning of the film. They bring it in.
But also, you know, as well as the Catholic, so let's put to the side the Catholic and Christian. But here, you know, to me, it reminds me. That's why I wanted to ask you that question before, because the Wizard of Oz, you know, there's a very Hollywood sort of I don't know, kind of trend here to me that will maybe be established later, but to me it reminds of, in advance, the Wizard of Oz with Judy Garland and, you know, the fairy, was that Fairy of the North or something, you know, but that position of Shearer, you know, kind of laughing and looking all jolly and stuff like that, to me, immediately, as soon as I saw that photo, I thought Judy Garland, the Wizard of Oz. Because I didn't know anything about Romeo and Juliet by George Cukor. And I know that George Cukor was later involved also in Gone with the Wind, I think. And I think also maybe The Wizard of Oz as an advisor rather than, so I don't know. I mean, that's why maybe this film, this image in particular, to me sounds as if it's pre-announcing quite a lot of other scenes from Hollywood later on.
Well, The Wizard of Oz was considered to be the first American fairy tale. Up until that point, and I think there's something like 21 books set in Oz. A lot of people think it's just one. And some of the books are really quite dark, how the Tin Woodsman becomes tin because he has his limbs hacked off one at a time and has to be replaced by blacksmith. But up until that time, in all folk tales, fairy tales in America, witches were all old, hunched, long noses, warts, evil. And then for the first time, we have a white witch. We have things, turns it on its head. Colour is not introduced in the film until they're in the land of Oz. And they're leaving Kansas, which is all in black and white, but it's supposed to be quite political as well. It's all democracy. It's all supposed to be the good American way of life, the farmers, and they are literally dirt poor. They have nothing at all. And then they go to Oz, which is at the time, it's run a sort of dictatorship. But in Oz, it's all colour. There are flowers everywhere. People are singing, you know. So it does challenge what's gone before.
Well, until they find out that Oz is not really such a powerful wizard in the end, you know, he was actually just hiding behind. But the other thing is that, do you think that, you know, in the wake of The Wizard of Oz in advance, because we look at that with hindsight, because we come a long time after, so we can look back at the trend. Do you think that this Romeo and Juliet was maybe presented as a fairy tale too?
Yeah, well, I said earlier on, it's presented as a Hollywood movie for a Hollywood audience at the time. They didn't go beyond the chocolate box romanticism, and that's okay. It's not a crime to make. Shakespeare is very, very, very good, but it's open to different interpretations in different ways. There's no one way of doing it. And if people want to go and see this movie, go and see the movie. You know, there's too much snobbery, academic snobbery in Shakespeare. Yes, you can take it to the most passionate, wonderful drama. I've always said, although there are exceptions, it's not really about the words. It's about the passion behind the words. Those passions which existed then still exist now. And they exist not just in Britain or America, in every nation in the world. That's why Shakespeare is so popular. The same passions that exist here are the same passions that people have in China, in Russia, in Japan, anywhere at all. And if you can capture that in the performance, and it's all about the performance. Shakespeare was never really designed to be read. It was designed to be viewed so you can bathe in these passions. That's why in the Midsummer Night's Dream, Puck says, I'll be an auditor. It doesn't mean he's going to do the books or the accounts. It means he's going to listen to what's going on, to listen to the performance. I've always thought that audio tapes of Shakespeare's plays are a great thing to do, because you become enclosed in the world of the people doing this. And there's some brilliant, brilliant versions out there. You don't have to go to the cinema and see an epic thing. It can become very intimate, very personal when you're sitting with headphones on and you really engage it. That's the great magic of Shakespeare, or any great playwright, to involve you, to become immersed in it. There's a story of Laurence Olivier on stage. I don't know what the play was. It may have been Lear, I don't know. But he absolutely brought the house down, thunderous applause, the entire place on its feet. And he was in the dressing room, exhausted. And someone came in and said to him, my God, Larry, have you any idea what you've done out there? And he said, yes, but I don't know how I did it. And it's because it's in the writing, but it takes a great actor to bring it to life, to do it, you know. So there are different ways to interpret it. As I said, this is not a serious take. I mean, it's fine. It's a fine film. It's not a serious take on Shakespeare. They got sidestepped with the Hollywood thing. The 1954 film, if you do that, you were talking about Technicolor. The director got sidestepped on Technicolor. They moved to Italy, the first external filming of Romeo and Juliet, the first one done in the streets of Italy. But he became so obsessed with Technicolor. Costumes changed all the time. Romeo has 3 different costumes in the first 10 minutes. He goes to the banquet in one costume and leaves in another. It actually intruded upon the film, and he made a big mistake with that.
Yeah, and also quite effeminate, isn't it? I mean, you know, that complete changing and transvesting into
there is a
another
scene,
over time, you know.
There is a scene in the 1954 film where Romeo comes out and he looks like some camp sidekick to a superhero.
Yeah,
he's so bright and he's so walking that it's so false. You think, no, this is a drama, this is tragedy, you know, belittling the whole thing. But that's just another interpretation as well.
but also, and the other thing that is really interesting about Shakespeare, that you know, you say it's not, Shakespeare's not for reading, well, other than maybe his poems, you know, his sonnets, and yeah.
Well, you've got Richard II and King John, which are written poetry, beautiful poetry, but you know, most of it, I think, you should listen to it or see it. Yeah.
And the monologues are beautiful poetry as well.
Yeah.
But then if you look at the folios, mainly what the important thing is in Shakespeare is actually the stage directions rather than the words. And I'm sure that a lot of Shakespeare was actually improvised at the time and changed because it was so connected to what was going on at the time in the politics, in the world, in the current affairs. And when people say that Shakespeare was didactic and edifying as a reading, well, I think that actually Shakespeare was mainly an entertainer, and people often forget that, you know, he entertained because the theatre was the place where people went for entertainment, and there was just all classes of people that went to the theatre, not just the elites.
Yeah, he was paid.
He was at the court for a while, you know, when the theatres were closed, he was working for the court, and there he had to pay particular attention not to.
Well, you can see that, you know, Macbeth is written to appease King James, the way it was written, I think. Richard III, and there's been a big thing lately because that film's coming out soon based on the King in a Car Park. People took great exception and based the villainy of the villainous persona that we took Richard III to be, blamed that on Shakespeare. But Shakespeare was a paid playwright. Mm-hmm. And the saying we have in Scotland is, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So you see it in Macbeth, you see it in, not much to, where the play changes halfway through. And the villainy we see for Richard III actually is more based on, I think, Olivier's performance than Shakespeare's writing. And it turns out that Laurence Olivier based the character of Richard III on a despised theatrical director called Jed Harris, whom everyone hated. And only after he'd made the film did he find out that the animators of Disney's Three Little Pigs based The Big Bad Wolf also on Jed Harris. You know? So people are looking for villainy, that's what it is. You know?
So yeah, so maybe I wonder if we could maybe just somehow say about this film that, you know, if we have the folio of Romeo and Juliet and understand that Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy, and we can read the tragedy through, you know, through the film as well, or the anticipation of the tragedy in this photograph. You know, Hollywood took the folio with the stage directions and turned it into a Hollywood basically tragedy or fairy tale maybe, and actually probably deposes even well on Shakespeare's tragedy, or as you say, like the most versatile tragedy or play that he ever wrote, which is Romeo and Juliet, that could actually be turned into, you know, through the stage directions, into anything that the directors, but also the actors were able to, you know, to create out of it. So this is very versatile also because it can be gone from, you know, an on-stage version of it into a Hollywood one, and then into the Castellani, and then into the postmodern of version of 1996. So this is definitely a Hollywood
Yeah.
Shakespeare.
Well, so also is the 1968 version as well. That is, in terms of, I've just remembered the other play I was talking about, Measure for Measure. You can actually go through Measure for Measure. About halfway through, it changes.
Yeah.
And it's almost, you can almost imagine someone from the court coming down and tapping Shakespeare on the shoulder and saying, we don't like the way this is getting done. This is going, change it. And you can actually see it change. First half and second half, two different plays altogether. But the 1968 Romeo and Juliet, from a cinematographic point of view, is wonderful. It's a pleasure on the eye and the ear. The score is fantastic, Nino Rota. And again, the beauty of everything, that everyone in that film is beautiful, everyone. One of the critics said all the boys would win a best boy contest. Everyone's gorgeous. Beauty is the central thing. And Zeffirelli said at the time, the whole thing is a celebration of youth and beauty, because he was, he had this morbid fear of growing old, seeing beautiful people growing old. He wanted to promote it purely on that. And that is why he offered the part of Romeo to Paul McCartney at the time, who was the icon of youth and beauty. I also think I don't think it's a coincidence that he gave Leonard Whiting the role of Romeo. He said in his autobiography, Zeffirelli, he was the most beautiful adolescent boy I had ever seen in my life. Zeffirelli was an actor in his younger days. If you look at a picture of Zeffirelli in his younger days and you look at a picture of Leonard Whiting at the time, there's a definite similarity. So I don't know if he was promoting self-love for himself. And of course, Olivia Hussey, breathtakingly beautiful. Everyone who plays Juliet on film at some point gets compared to Olivia Hussey. And it's usually negative because she was so beautiful. Even the 1996 film, when it came out, quite a famous person, I won't say who, saw the film and talked of Claire Danes' Juliet. And the phrase he used was, comparing to Olivia Hussey, she's a bit of an ugly duckling Juliet, which I thought was a very honest way of looking at it. That's how she was judged by a lot of people in the world. When that film came out, everyone said she's not as beautiful as Olivia Hussey. Again, beauty becomes the central pillar for Juliet, and it shouldn't be. That's why there was a play called Juliet and Romeo down in Wales with Sian Phillips, who played Juliet at the age of 76. And I was invited down by Shan Phillips to go and see it down in Wales, and spoke to her afterwards. And she was magnificent. She was absolutely brilliant in the role, because they played the role as first love, not as teenage love. And it happened to her in the play in her 70s, and it was more moving. And that's in that particular play. The chap who was playing Romeo, he was in his 70s as well. It was so moving when he said that line, and he said it the proper way. Have I not loved till now? Just as the door is closing on his life expectancy, when he thinks he's led this life of great love and glorious love, only then, at the very end of his life, does he appreciate and, you know, is enraptured by true love. And then, just after he's accepted it, he loses it. So it's a true tragedy, you know. If it's done properly, it will move you. But if you want to see chocolate box romanticism, there's always an audience for that. You know, I don't despise people or give people a hard time. You know, this is why romantic films, there's always romantic films out there. Go and see them if you want to go and see them. It's not a problem. You don't have to be forced into watching King Lear. You know, I've personally speaking, I get depressed going to see Hamlet before the curtain goes up, because I think, oh God, I'm going to be lectured here for the next 2.5, 3 hours. I'm going to get this great epic of academia thrown at me, and I've got to sit here and understand it and bask in it and be fully understanding of the genius of it all. That's not what you want on a night out. It's not what I want, you know. So.
And also, yeah, I'm sure that, you know, if Shakespeare was to be seen from himself as someone who inspires only academic, he would probably turn in his grave, because he probably,
yeah,
laughter was the center of, not always laughter, you know, but throughout.
No, you've got a good point. There's a lot of people out there who say, you know, these people say Shakespeare didn't write the plays, and they say the plays were all written by Johnson. There's not a joke in Johnson. And there are jokes all over Shakespeare. Some of them quite bawdy.
Yeah. And also Christopher Marlowe was, you know, the other possibility. I'm sure that.
Oh, there are so many. Queen Elizabeth was one that I'd read, which was quite good, because she wrote some of the best plays years after she was dead. So that was quite an accomplishment, you know.
Yeah. Oh, well, so listen, I mean, I think that this has been really, really interesting lecture, going deeper into this film that no one knew really of before you talked about. I never knew about this Romeo and Juliet. Of course, I knew all about Zeffirelli, but not about this one. And also about the next one that Tony would like to go into is the 1954 by Castellani.
Yeah, that's called, I interpret that's called the Forgotten Juliet. But at the time, it was huge. It won the Golden Lion at Venice. It beat things like On the Waterfront, a Kurosawa film. I can't remember the films that were nominated, but every single one of them was a classic. And Romeo and Juliet won. And within less than a year, it's fallen from grace, and it's never fully recovered. Although there are some very good points in the film. And, you know, you watch that film, well, I watch the film, and I look at it and I think, there is an absolutely brilliant film in there somewhere, but this is not it. You know, if they'd been a bit more disciplined and a bit more professional at the time, that could have been something really special.
Oh, but thanks to you now is Tony, thank you very much for everything.
Okay.
Unless someone else has got the question, we can probably close quite soon, because we've been here for a while now. But if anybody has a final question, please ask it now.
Please do, or forever hold your peace. No? Okay, I'll try and get a t-shirt for next time, but I'm not promising.
Yeah, do that. My son is a brilliant drawer, and he could draw you something that you could then transfer on a t-shirt.
Transfer onto a t-shirt. Yeah, one of the kids in school actually said that to me today. They said, have you just got one black t-shirt, Mr. Quinn, and you iron transfers all the time?
Okay, so well, thanks everybody for your time, and for I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed this lecture. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Benvenuto, Antonio. Grazie.
I'm going for something strong and medicinal.
Buona serata.